Aquascape Part 2. Thanks again for joining us. If you remember in Part 1, we started out with Marco Dry Rock, which I really like working with. We made some essentially pedestals to raise each of the Aquascape structures off of the sand bed for better flow, and we started to sculpt our Aquascape pieces. We also started to make some wrasse hotels, which are some just pockets of deeper sand for wrasse and other fish to live in. And we ended up putting everything into a tub to cycle for a couple months. So this is going to be a peninsula tank, and with the one short side up against the wall, I'll have some MP60s on it, but I wanted everywhere else to essentially be covered with Zoas. Now, I didn't want the Zoas to be on the tank glass itself. I wanted to create a system that I could take frags on and off the wall at will, put a single polyp, have it spread over removable pieces so I could easily essentially propagate Zoas and shift colors around the way I wanted. And so to accomplish this, essentially I needed to create a lattice that I could hang frags on. So in thinking about how to attach this lattice to the back of the tank, basically we're going to be creating some hard points, siliconing to the back of the glass, and then using some black egg crate as the lattice, and then putting the frags on that black egg crate. And I thought about how to attach the hard points. I could have used acrylic, but acrylic doesn't really bond to glass and silicone very well. And so I'm actually making the hard points out of little pieces of glass. And this was a bit of a process. I went to a bunch of glass shops and tried to get these little pieces cut for me, but most glass shops really didn't want to take the time to make these little pieces. They had often a minimum price per piece, and it was incredibly expensive. So I got larger pieces that were incredibly cheap and then just cut them down myself. So after cutting all the pieces, I'm going to glue two together to make each of the hard points. And this is basically just to give me a little bit more surface area to glue against the back wall, ½ inch rather than just 1/4 of an inch. But also because I'm going to be drilling holes in each of these for the hard points, because they're silicone together, if they crack a little bit, I don't really care because they're gonna keep their integrity because they're gonna be silicone together. So here they are siliconed on the back wall, just held in place with painter's tape while the silicone dries. I've used a zip tie spacer behind each of them, and that'll come into play later. And basically, these just work in a pattern, as you'll see here, around each of the MP60s. So I attached the black egg crate to each of the hard points using zip ties, and I used 2 of the large Fiji Cube frag racks that have the cool little tabs that hold in the frag plugs. It was a little bit easier to use 2 of those and actually drill into the overflow and use some gaskets and screws to attach those, rather than trying to jury rig something up with the egg crate. You can see here the way I attached these to the hard points is the top section was zip tied behind the hard point and the bottom was zip tied in front, and basically that gave just a little bit of angle to each of these panels, which will make holding on the frag plugs a little bit easier. So here's the frag wall with all of the rock attached. And each of these pieces of rock, with the exception of the Fiji Cube frag wall, which are attached just using regular frag plugs, are attached using just some ½ inch acrylic rod glued onto the back of each of these pieces of rock. And then that just is inserted into the egg crate. And there's a good inch and a half behind each of these panels, which allows good water flow, I think, behind it. And I made sure to position the hard points in such a way that the MP60s are not starved. I think they'll be able to kind of suck the water from behind the frag wall, and that should work out pretty well. Now, admittedly, this just looks like a bunch of rock on the back wall right now, which is just what it is. And in this upper right-hand corner will be the intake for the closed loop, and I'll cover that with some of the same style of rock to make that blend in. So we've started to fill the tank, which is exciting. I've added some salt, which is why the water is cloudy, and some heaters just to get this up to temp and salinity. I'll then leave it about 2/3 of the way full, which will just make getting the rock and sand in there a little bit easier. This is a taller tank, it's 31 inches, so it's just easier to work in without it being completely full initially, even though it will continue to be a pain in the butt, I'm sure, being this tall to work in, but that's the trade-off I made. So. And if you remember from the aquascaping video part 1, we added in the finished aquascaping pieces into a vat to cycle. And this has been cooking now for about 2 months. We've been adding bacteria and some Brightwell quick cycle nutrients, and this is kind of giving us a head start. About the same time, 2 months ago, we ordered 10 pounds of Maricultured Florida live rock. And this has been in the quarantine system hanging out, and we've been super gluing over Aptasia, we've been removing crabs, and basically getting this rock as pest-free as we can, getting it ready to add into the tank. And this will add some extra biodiversity and is kind of a hybrid cycle approach that will hopefully address one of the quintessential problems of starting a tank with dry rock, which is that you're not starting it with live rock. So hopefully this will be helpful. Inevitably, there is a point in time when you look at your aquascape in your tank for the first time and you compare that reality with how you had envisioned it in your mind and you take stock. And this looks pretty good. I will probably add in some additional pieces here and there. It needs a little bit more height in the back, but this is a good starting point. And really, when it comes to aquascape, you know, a year and a half from now, the rock will be indistinguishable. You won't even be able to see the outline because it will be completely covered with corals. But at this point, it's, I think, a good starting point. It allows for good flow and enough coral mounting space. We are using pretty chunky crushed coral for sand, and that's just because this tank should have some pretty rip and flow, and anything finer than that is just going to be blown all over the place. I did use special grade, which is a little bit finer for inside the RAS hotels here, just to make bedding down for some fish a little bit easier. So thanks for joining us once again. You know, the tank is obviously plumbed and running, so we'll get to the plumbing video next.